Some stories begin with a meeting, others begin with a prayer. But this story began with a dream. And for years, the man who had that dream did not understand why it kept returning. Kyoto was quiet that night. The narrow streets outside Ida's apartment were nearly empty, illuminated only by the soft glow of street lamps and the occasional passing bicycle. Inside his small studio apartment, camera equipment sat neatly arranged on shelves. Ida had always lived a life of careful order. At 43, he was a well-respected photographer whose work had appeared in travel magazines across Japan. His photographs captured moments most people overlooked: a lantern swaying in the wind, a child laughing in a marketplace, the quiet stillness of morning fog over a temple. But while Ida was skilled at capturing beauty in the world around him, there was one area of life he never quite understood: love. He had dated in his younger years. Nothing serious, nothing lasting. And as the years passed, the thought of marriage slowly drifted into the background of his life. Not because he had rejected it, but because it simply hadn't happened. Until the dream. It began one spring night. Ida had fallen asleep after editing photos from a recent assignment in Osaka. The dream felt vivid from the very beginning. He was standing in a park he didn't recognize. Cherry blossom petals drifted through the air like soft pink snow. And across the path, seated on a wooden bench, was a woman. He couldn't see her face clearly at first, but he remembered something about her presence. Calm, warm, familiar. She was reading a book, a small smile resting on her lips as the wind moved gently through her curly hair. Then she looked up, and their eyes met. The moment lasted only a few seconds. But in that instant, Ida felt something strange. Not excitement, not shock. Something deeper. Recognition. As though he had known her long before this moment. Before he could speak, the dream faded. Ida woke up suddenly. The early morning sunlight was just beginning to creep through the curtains. He sat up slowly. The dream lingered in his mind with unusual clarity. But dreams were just dreams. Within a few minutes, he dismissed it. He had work to do, and life moved on. 3 weeks later, the dream returned. This time, the setting was different. Ida was inside a small cafe. The same woman sat across the room, laughing softly with someone he could not see. Her laughter was warm and full of life. He noticed something else this time. The book she held in her hands. A Bible. Before he could move toward her, the dream ended again. Ida woke up staring at the ceiling. This time, he felt slightly unsettled. It wasn't the dream itself, it was the familiarity of it. He had never seen this woman before. Yet something about her presence felt real. Still, he brushed the thought aside. Life continued. Assignments. Editing photographs. Traveling across Japan. But the dream did not disappear. It returned again and again. Over the next year, Ida dreamed of the same woman several times. Sometimes she was sitting in a park. Sometimes walking through a quiet street. Sometimes praying inside a church. And every time their eyes met, the dream ended. Eventually, curiosity turned into reflection. Ida had recently started exploring Christianity. A friend had invited him to an international church in Osaka where people from many countries gathered each Sunday. The messages about faith and purpose stirred something in him he hadn't expected. One evening after service, he sat alone inside the quiet sanctuary, and he prayed for the first time in his life. The words felt unfamiliar, but sincere. God, if you are real, guide my life. He hesitated. Then he added something he had never prayed before. And if marriage is part of that life, lead me to the right woman. He paused. The dream came back to his mind, and without fully understanding why, he said one more sentence. If that woman in the dream is real, help me recognize her. Time moved quietly. Seasons changed. Assignments took Ida to different cities. the dreams slowly became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped completely. Life settled back into its normal rhythm. Photography, travel, church, friendships, and the dream faded into memory, almost forgotten, until 3 years later. There is a particular kind of patience that faith asks of a person, not the passive kind, not simply waiting with folded hands, but the active kind, the kind that keeps showing up, keeps working, keeps living fully, even when the thing you prayed for has not yet arrived. That was the kind of patience Eita learned in those 3 years. He traveled to Hokkaido in winter and photographed snowfall over silent forests. He spent a month in Okinawa capturing the colors of coral reefs through an underwater lens. He photographed festivals, temples, coastlines, and the faces of people who had no idea they were being observed in their most ordinary, beautiful moments. His work grew richer during those years, deeper somehow, as if the waiting had taught him to see more carefully. His faith also deepened. He became a regular at the International Church in Osaka. He joined a small Bible study group that met on Thursday evenings. He made friends he had not expected to make, people from different countries, different backgrounds, all gathered around the same quiet faith. He did not speak often about the dream. It felt too personal, too strange to explain to someone who hadn't experienced it. But sometimes, on evenings when the church was quiet and the last light of the day came through the windows at a particular angle, he would think about it. The park, the cherry blossoms, the woman with the curly hair and the small smile, and the sense of recognition that had felt, even in a dream, more real than most things he had experienced while awake. He had stopped trying to understand it. He had simply decided to trust the one who had sent it. And life, quiet, purposeful, faithful life, continued, until 3 years later, when everything he had been waiting for walked into a festival in Kyoto. On the other side of Japan, someone else's story was unfolding. Mutheu had moved to Japan nearly a decade earlier. Originally, she had come for graduate school. Tokyo had fascinated her. The culture, the discipline, the quiet beauty of everyday life. After graduation, she was offered a position at an international consulting firm. The job was challenging, but rewarding. So she stayed. Now, at 39, Mutheu had built a life she never imagined when she first arrived. A career she loved. A community at her international church. Friends who felt like family. Yet one prayer remained in her heart. Marriage. Not out of pressure, but out of hope. One evening after Bible study, Mutheu walked through a quiet park on her way home. Cherry blossoms drifted through the air. She sat on a wooden bench and opened her Bible. And she whispered a quiet prayer. God, if the man you have for me is somewhere in this world, guide us to each other. She smiled softly, then added one more sentence. But only in your timing. Kenya felt far away sometimes, not in a painful way. Just in the way that distance always feels when you have built a life somewhere else, real enough that returning would feel like leaving too. Mutheu had arrived in Tokyo at 29 with 2 suitcases, a scholarship letter, and a quiet determination that she had inherited from her mother. The first year had been hard. The language, the winters, the particular loneliness of being the only Kenyan in most rooms she walked into. But she had found her footing. Slowly at first, and then all at once. The International Church had helped more than anything else. It was there she found community, a diverse, warm, faith-filled group of people who had all, in their own way, chosen Japan as home. She was known there for 2 things: her laugh, full and unrestrained, the kind that made people turn their heads and smile without knowing why, and her faith, quiet but unshakable, the kind that had been tested enough times to know it was real. Her consulting work had taken her across Asia, Singapore, Seoul, Hong Kong, Osaka. She was good at her job in the way that people who genuinely love what they do are good. Not because they are chasing recognition, but because the work itself matters to them. She had been asked to relocate twice. Both times she had declined. Japan, she had realized somewhere along the way, was home now. The only prayer that remained, the one she brought to God quietly and consistently without desperation or deadline, was the one for a husband. Not just any man, the right one. The one God had made for her. She had seen enough of the wrong kind of relationships to know the difference between settling and trusting, and she had chosen trust. So she lived her life fully, traveled, served at church, laughed with friends, and prayed with the quiet confidence of a woman who had learned that God's timing, though rarely convenient, was always right. She did not know that on the other side of Japan, a photographer had once dreamed of a woman with curly hair sitting on a wooden bench reading a book. She did not know about the prayer whispered in a quiet sanctuary, or the 3 years of faithful waiting that had followed. She simply knew this. God had not forgotten her, and she had not stopped trusting him. 2 months later, Eita was photographing a cultural festival in Kyoto. The Kyoto festival had been on his assignment calendar for weeks. It was the kind of event he loved to photograph, the collision of color and tradition and ordinary human, joy that only festivals could produce. He had arrived early, before the crowds thickened, and spent the morning moving through the streets with his camera, capturing lanterns being hung, a child in a yukata chasing a friend down a narrow alley, an elderly couple watching the preparations with the particular quiet happiness of people who had seen this festival many times before. By early afternoon, the streets were full. Music from a traditional ensemble drifted across the square. The smell of grilled skewers and sweet dango filled the air. Eita moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 20 years learning how to be present without being noticed. That was the gift of his work. He knew how to disappear into a moment just long enough to capture it. He was adjusting his lens near a line of food stalls when he saw her. She was standing a little apart from the crowd, not watching the festival so much as being inside it, unhurried, present, at ease. Her curly hair caught the afternoon light. Her friend was saying something, and she was listening with her whole face. Then she smiled, and something inside Eita's chest went very still. He lifted his camera, a reflex, the instinct of a man who had spent his life responding to beauty by trying to preserve it. But then he stopped, because she looked up, and her eyes, warm, clear, completely unguarded, met his across the crowd. The festival continued around them, music playing, people moving, laughter rising from a nearby stall. But Eita stood completely still, because he knew that face, not from life, from years earlier, from a dream in a park full of cherry blossoms, from a prayer whispered in a quiet sanctuary when the words still felt unfamiliar in his mouth, from 3 years of faithful waiting that had felt, in that exact moment, like the most reasonable thing he had ever done. He lowered his camera slowly, and for the first time in his life, Eita stepped towards something he could not photograph. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them continued moving, people walking, music playing, laughter in the background. But Eita stood still, his heart beating faster than he could explain. He stepped forward slowly. "Excuse me." Mutheu turned toward him politely. "Yes?" Eita hesitated, then said the only honest thing he could. "This may sound strange, but I feel like I've seen you before." Mutheu laughed gently. "That's a very interesting way to introduce yourself." He smiled nervously. "Yes, I suppose it is." Then he said something neither of them would forget, I think. "I dreamed about you." UV blinked in surprise, and for the first time, the story God had begun years earlier finally started to unfold. Mutheu's friend Saki, who had known Mutheu long enough to read her expressions accurately, took one look at the situation and quietly stepped back. Not far, just far enough to give the moment room. Mutheu looked at the man standing in front of her. He was holding a camera. His expression was not the practiced confidence of someone who approached strangers often. It was something more honest than that, slightly disbelieving, as if he himself could not entirely explain what he was doing. "You dreamed about me?" she repeated slowly. Not a question, just the words, placed carefully in the air between them. "Yes," he said. More than once, Mutheu studied him for a moment. In her years in Japan, she had been approached in many ways, some polished, some awkward, some forgettable. But she had never been approached like this, with such quiet, undefended honesty. "What was I doing?" she asked, in the dream. Ida thought for a moment. "Reading," he said, "in a park. There were cherry blossoms." He paused. "And another time, you were laughing in a cafe. You were holding a Bible." Something shifted in Mutheu's expression, small but visible. The way a person looks when something lands closer to the truth than they expected. "I'm Ida," he said quietly. "I'm a photographer." He gestured toward his camera almost apologetically. "I was here for the festival." Mutheu smiled, slowly, the same smile he recognized, the one from the dream. "I'm Mutheu," she said. "I'm from Kenya. I live in Tokyo." They stood for a moment in the middle of the festival, the world moving cheerfully around them. Then Mutheu said something she had not planned to say, something that simply arrived, fully formed, from a place deeper than logic. "I pray every morning," she said quietly. "And I've been praying for a long time that God would lead me to the right person." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know what your dreams mean," she said, "but I don't think you're here by accident." Ida was quiet for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Neither do I." Behind them, the festival continued its joyful noise. But in that small, still space between two people who had been quietly moving toward each other for years without knowing it, something had just begun. What happened next unfolded the way the best things do. Slowly, carefully, with the particular patience of two people who have learned not to rush what God is building. Ida and Mutheu exchanged numbers at the festival that afternoon. They met for coffee the following week, then dinner, then church. And with every conversation, the dream that had once felt strange became something else entirely. Evidence of a God who plans further ahead than we can see, who plants a face in a man's dream years before the meeting, who keeps a woman's prayer alive across a decade of faithful waiting, who arranges a festival and a crowd, and a particular angle of afternoon light that makes a photographer look up from his camera at exactly the right moment. Their story was its own, complete, beautiful, written by the same hand that writes all the best ones. But it was not the only story being written, because in the same connected world, in the same city of Tokyo where Mutheu had built her life, another quiet story was already unfolding. A young man named Takaru had once sat in a Boston cafe and watched a woman laugh. He never spoke to her, but that night he prayed. And 5 years later, God answered. In a park, on a bench, with a Bible in her lap. Because that is how God works in this universe. Quietly, faithfully, one story at a time, each one different, each one connected, each one written long before the first page was turned. He dreamed of her face before he ever knew her name. He prayed for her before he could describe her. He waited 3 years without knowing what he was waiting for. And then, at a festival in Kyoto, on an afternoon that looked like every other afternoon, she looked up, and he knew. That is how God works. Quietly, faithfully, further ahead than we can see. This is the God wrote this love story Japan universe, a connected world of faith, patience, and love stories that were written long before anyone arrived at the first chapter. Subscribe to Written by Grace, Faith, and Forever Stories for more. And watch the woman he prayed 5 years to see again, because in this universe, the stories don't end. They connect.